In this session, we are going to look at John's vision of heaven. I find in the church, when you say, where does the book of Revelation picture heaven? Most people think of Revelation 21 and 22, the new heaven and the new earth. But that is precisely the new heaven and the new earth. The vision of heaven by itself actually occurs in chapter 4. Before turning to that vision, I want to provide just a little in the way of reminder from our previous session as historical setting into which to place this vision. John, a prophet, is writing to a number of churches in Asia Minor, 7, in order to encourage them to stand up for witness to the great transformation that John believes is coming from this old broken age, represented by the Roman Empire with idolatry and violence, pointing toward a coming new world, often known as the realm of God, a world of love, peace, justice, and abundance, with Jesus Christ as the agent of transformation. John writes in order to assure people that this transformation is coming, and he writes to encourage them to unleash their ties with the Roman Empire and its ways of idolatry and injustice, and to witness to God's purposes for all people to live together in love, peace, justice, and abundance. In the first vision in the book of Revelation, John pictures the cosmic, risen, ruling Christ. Then John writes 7 letters to 7 churches, pointing out where some of them are faithful in their witness, others much less so, reinforcing the faithful and urging those who are less than faithful to amend their ways and join the community in its movement toward the new world. Following those 7 letters, John reveals God in heaven as a way of assuring the reader that everything that has come so far and that follows comes not from John's imagination, not from John's creative powers, but on the authority of God. And the vision of heaven, like the vision of the ruling Christ, is in symbols that people in that world would have understood. At the center of the vision, there is a throne. Now, in medieval Europe, a throne was a big chair with a high back. But in antiquity, the throne on which Caesar sat was a much more modest piece of furniture with a kind of semi-circle base and legs, on which in heaven God sits. John never tries to describe God, but John does describe the effect of God. So I'm going to draw a something here, but will try to avoid myself the danger of drifting into an idolatry by picturing God in my own image. And John says that the one seated on the throne looked like jasper and carnelian, 2 very valuable gems from the ancient world. And I think a way to picture this that would be familiar to our sensory way of being in the world is to remember going to the skating rink, where there is in the middle of the room a disco ball, a ball on which there are about 1,000 little mirrors, and at a certain point in the skating night, they turn the house lights on, and they shine a light, a spotlight on this disco ball, which turns and just illuminates the whole room in the most magical, sometimes awesome way. The one seated on the throne has that luminous quality. Around the throne is a rainbow that looks like an emerald. There are two things to be said about this rainbow. Number one, it is a symbol of promise. It is a way of communicating through a visual image that the purposes of God are ultimately promissory. And number two, it is like an emerald, green, signifying generativity, growth, and value. Around the main throne, there are 24 smaller thrones. These thrones are seats for elders. There are 24 because there were 12 tribes of Israel and 12 apostles. So we have in these elders a representation of the entire community of God, from the promises to Abraham and Sarah to the final consummation. God's purposes have been consistent from Genesis to Revelation. And I might say, by way of side comment, this undercuts the devaluing of the first 39 books, the anti-Jewish prejudice, and the extreme phenomenon of anti-Semitism that has so haunted so much of Christian history. Here we have all of God's people gathered around the throne. The elders are dressed in white robes, like the one like a human being, the heavenly judge and redeemer in the first vision, signifying that they have real authority and real power to stand in his stead, to do the things he did, and to witness in the way that he witnessed. They are, as it were, smaller extensions of his larger, even cosmic power and ministry. And in a certain way, they represent the leadership of the church. On their heads are golden crowns. These too are symbols of authority and power. I draw the crown in this kind of European way, just as a convenience. To symbolize the fact that these figures have real authority and power. What they do, what they say, really matters, and insofar as their words partake of the word spoken by the one like the human being, the heavenly judge and redeemer, their words have real power, something we preachers need to remember. But what do they do with their crowns? In our power-hungry culture, we grab power and hold it to ourselves at all costs. But they take their crowns and they put them before the one who is seated on the throne. They put themselves and their urges and their power at the service of the purposes of the one who aims for a new heaven and a new earth. And in front of the throne, there is a sea, as it were, a sea of glass. In the Hebrew Bible, often, not always, water is associated with chaos, with threat. Here, in the presence of the one on the throne, that which is most threatening is turned into a thing of beauty. The chaos not only loses its power, but is itself transformed. And in the sea of glass, there are 7 lights, 7 torches. Let me draw them like this. Seven torches, which represent, we learn from chapter 1, verse 20, the 7 spirits of God, which are angels. We talk in many cultures about having a guardian angel, and the concept here is similar, that in the end-time literature they believe that God appointed an angel for each community to mediate messages from God and to mediate providence and judgment. Here, the torches are in the sea of glass, meaning that God's providence operates over, under, around, and within each of the 7 churches. If you are in the church and faithful, then it is as if you are in the sea of glass. And around the throne are 4 living creatures. One of them is an ox. They considered the ox the most prominent of the domestic creatures. There is a lion, whom they considered the most prominent of the wild creatures. There is a bird, which they considered the most prominent of the flying creatures. And there is the human being, whom they considered the crown of creation, just a little lower than the angels. These creatures represent all living creatures which derive their being from God and whose purpose is to serve the purposes of God. And one of the striking things about these creatures is that they have wings, meaning that they are not limited to time and space as we are, and they are covered with eyes within and without. Recollecting the eyes of the flames of fire of the figure, one like the human being, the heavenly judge and redeemer in Revelation 1, the eye is the symbol of perception, the capacity to see what is really there. Now, I think it's a little creepy having eyes all over, inside and out, but the point is, in the presence of God, serving the purposes of God, you can see what is really there. You can see beyond the mask, behind the curtain, beyond the wall. You can see what is really there outside, and you can see what is really there inside. And because you are in the presence of God, you have the capacity to accept and respond to what you see without and within. And because these creatures have wings, they are not limited in what they can see in the way that you and I are limited by what we can see by virtue of the fact that we only walk on the earth. This is John's way of saying that this vision gives us a transcendent perspective on what is happening around us, and we can trust it because these eyes are illumined by the presence of God. And then, day and night, these creatures sing, "Holy, holy, holy, the Lord God the Almighty, who was and is to come." This formula, who was and is to come, should not roll off our lips unnoticed. It contrasts with the formula that some of the Greek religions had of their gods, who were, who are, and who shall be. A past, yes. A present, yes. And a future, continuous with the present, indeed shall be, continuing in the future as the present, the brokenness, the violence, the injustice, the idolatry, the falsehood. Contrast this with the God who is to come into history, undoing the old and doing something so new that it is called a new heaven and a new earth. And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to the one who is seated on the throne forever and ever, the 24 elders bow down and cast their crowns before the golden sea. This vision, of course, is where we get our hymn, "Holy, holy, holy." Holy, at its root, means to be set apart, to be other than, not to be dependent on, not to be disconnected, but not to be fouled by the way things are, to be singular in purpose. This is what it means to sing, "Holy, holy, holy." It is to recognize this vision not only as the foundation for life, but as the way in which we draw inspiration for being able to interpret the things around us and to want to be committed in every way to the values and practices represented in this vision, articulated in this book, brought to expression through Jesus Christ, framed by the story of Israel.